There are several objects with built-in generators, so that every time that object is loaded in, once the object species is selected, it will generate a new variation of that object. And you'll end up with something completely different each time, at least within the parameters of the species. The objects that support this or have this built-in generator are the infinite terrains, the plant species, the rocks, and the metaclouds. There are additional ways to create variations using the randomize buttons, which we'll take a look at in a minute. First, what I want to show you is the infinite terrains. So if we right-click on the procedural terrain icon, which is the terrain with a little F on it, right-click on that, and it's going to open up the library for the infinite terrains, and these are the ones that just come with Vue. I'm going to select the Strata 2 and click OK. And it's going to ask if you'd like to discard the ground plane. I'm going to select yes, and then show the sea level in the view. I'm going to switch to the 4 viewport mode just by, you can double click on this top bar. You can also use this icon up here to switch between and toggle the full screen mode. So I'm going to go ahead and select my camera and move it up a little bit so we can see the terrain better. Now if you don't see this movement gizmo or this object gizmo and it looks more like this, then what you can do is turn on gizmos, and I've got mine set to a keyboard shortcut. But if you go up to display in gizmos, you can choose to show the gizmos. So now with this terrain, I guess, species loaded in, it's basically an easy way to think of it. If we were to reload the same terrain, if I right-click, it's going to ask if we'd like to replace the existing terrain. I'm going to select yes, and it should generate, you can see, a different terrain within the parameters of that infinite terrain. If we edit the object, sometimes if you double-click on the object, it won't open the terrain editor. If that happens, you could just right-click, go to Edit Object, at least if you're within the standalone version. I also want to note, if you're using the using xStream within your host application, the command to load in those terrain presets is load terrain preset. So now if we go into the terrain editor, another way we could randomize this is, or modify it a bit, is just to use the randomize button within the procedural tab. So within the procedural tab, we've got this little button here on the right of the altitude production, the upper right. We can click that, and what it's going to do is internally change the seed, the vector seed, which is tied to the function that's creating this. If we right-click, go to Edit Function, we'll see what is generating this terrain. We've got 2 terrain fractals being mixed together with a strata filter, and manipulation of the vector here makes it a little bit easier to work with the infinite terrain. But here's the vector seed. So as we click the randomize button, this vector seed is changed to a random vector value, which in turn will change the look of the terrain. So you can either load in the preset more than once to generate a variation, or you can randomize. Materials can also be randomized. If we right-click, edit the material, find the randomize button within each material as well. Clicking the randomize button will also add that vector3 seed node to any function that doesn't already have it. So if you don't have a vector3 seed on the position or from the position input going down to your function in your controllers, it will add one for you, which is nice. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. I'll just go ahead and close the scene and file new in order to get the default scene back, or my default scene. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is the plant species. right-click and we can open up the different plants. If you're seeing a lot of extra plants with cornucopia icons, you can go down to this little ghost icon and choose to hide cornucopia items, or show a small selection of cornucopia items, or show all of them. So the ghost icon, it might also look like a cornucopia icon to begin with by default. So I'm going to go ahead and load in the alder species. And now anytime I load in this plant, now that I've chosen a species, I can just select to create a plant as opposed to load from plant species. So right-clicking on the plant icon will give you the option to choose a species. So now anytime we click on the plant icon or to create option to create a plant, it's going to use that species and grow a new plant from that species. And this is basically what happens when you create an ecosystem. It generates a new variation. With most plant species, there's a predetermined amount of variations it will create. The higher amount of geometry there is for the species, the lower amount of variations it will create in order to keep memory within bounds. And it can range anywhere from 4 to up to, I think, 20 or so variations, depending on the species. What we can also do with plants is if you want to create a new variation, you can edit the object to open up the plant editor. And what we can do is go to New Plant up at the top, and it's going to grow a new plant. So you can go through that option and generate new species that way. It's taking a little bit longer for my screen to refresh because this is a higher level of geometry object, and also because I'm recording the screen. So if you want to see that a little faster of an action, go ahead and load in one of the lower res plants, which is basically the set of plants that's in the beginning of the list. We can edit the object, and you can see we can very quickly create different variations. So next we'll take a look at the rocks. So we can right-click to load from the templates, and there's a list of high-res rocks, low-res, the faceted ones, smooth. And these are all going to give you the option, or will generate new variations as well. So if I load in the stratified rock and click OK, it's going to build me a rock. And now if I go to create a rock, it's going to create another rock from that template. And a cool thing is if they're in the same place, or you don't move the original rock when you load it in, it will basically stack rocks on top of each other as you load them in. So you can create new species and keep, or create new rocks, and from that template it'll keep stacking the rocks. Even if you choose a different rock, it'll continue to do that. That's just part of the drop object command that's built in. Now, if you notice it takes a long time to build a rock, especially if you're loading it into an ecosystem, that's because the first time you select a rock template, especially with an ecosystem, what it does is it creates a cached file of all of your variations the first time you generate that rock from the template, and then it uses that cache from then on. So if you start using the same rock templates, things will go much quicker in the future, so that it's just that first time you load from that template, it's going to take a little bit longer to generate. So we can also go into the objects and select the material, and we can randomize if you want to offset and create a new variation within that material. So some additional ways to create variations. And the last primary generator is the Metacloud. What we can do is Metacloud from preset to load in a Metacloud. Choose from the Metaclouds available. And I'm going to pick the dark and rough Metacloud. And right there we've just got a pretty simple one. We can go ahead and delete that. And if we click now to create a Metacloud, it'll generate a new Metacloud. So anytime we click that button, it'll create a new cloud from that preset. You can also go into the material and randomize the cloud within that preset, and also define a lot of the other values too. And I just want to make a couple of notes about the Metacloud objects. We'll go ahead and load a larger one in. We'll use the cumulonimbus. And what this is made up of, and I'm going to go ahead and change my scale a bit to 0.5 for the material up in the aspect tab. And now this tab within xStream, these options, you'll find that under object properties. So if you select the object properties option, it should give you a little panel that looks just like this. Now to edit the cloud, if we take a look and expand the cumulonimbus group, we have a lot of spheres, and these spheres are what make up the cloud. So we can manipulate and modify, position the spheres where we want them in order to customize the cloud. If you want to add additional spheres, now that I'm within the cloud and have one of the spheres selected within the group, the cloud icon has changed to add the icon for Add Metacloud Primitive. So we can click that option to add a new primitive, a new sphere within the cloud. We can also choose different Metacloud presets. If we load in a material, you'll find those under Clouds, Metacloud Materials. So load from the Metacloud Materials, and these are also restricted to Metaclouds. This type of material, this volumetric material, cannot be loaded onto any other type of object. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working with Metaclouds. There really is kind of one last object that is somewhat more random in the way that infinite terrains are, where you've just got to change really in the randomness or the vector seed. And what we can do is add cloud layers, and these objects will typically change and generate new variations. So we'll add another cloud layer. It should be a little different. And we can also randomize that cloud by going into the atmosphere editor clouds and selecting it, or you can choose the edit object command. And if it sometimes it'll open a different tab in the atmosphere editor. You can just go over to clouds, and then you'll find that. One thing that does change is most layers will stack on top of each other. So if I add another version of the high cumulus, you can see that the altitude is higher than the previous one, so it will offset them and kind of stack them on top of each other. Standard terrains are also randomly generated. Anytime you add a standard terrain to the scene, it is going to be different. And if you open up the terrain editor, you can go down to the lower right and select New in order to create a randomly generated terrain. The procedural terrain, regular procedural terrain option also has the same option where you can click New And this basically, clicking the new option would be the same as a default terrain being randomized. Because whenever you click new, it will reset the fractal that's part of the altitude production back to the default.